Hello and welcome to Mr. Sea History. Now today I'm on a journey to find out more about the Franklin expedition, this famous expedition up to the northern parts of the Canadian Arctic to find the fabled Northwest Passage, which sadly did not return under great mystery. And so we're going to look at some of the remnants of what we can find here in London, tell the story about what happened and crucially the most recent discoveries. Just behind all these lorries here is a statue of Sir John Franklin, and this is Waterloo Place, and he's there because that was his club, the Athenaeum, behind there. Now, who was Sir John Franklin, and most importantly also, what was the Northwest Passage, which I've just mentioned? Well, that was the fabled route through the Arctic to Asia, the better way of trading. This is before the Suez Canal was built, and to get to China and get to those big trading posts of the Straits of Malacca, etc., it was really hard to get there, so through around Africa, etc. So to get through the Arctic would be amazing, so there's a huge search on to find that. The Admiralty is very keen. And one person who they assigned to find that is, of course, Sir John Franklin. Now, he's an interesting choice to lead this expedition, mainly because of his age. In 1845, he's 59 years old, which for the Middle Victorian times, that's pretty old anyway. To go on an Arctic expedition is unbelievably ancient, really. Also, his track record is, at best, you'd say mixed. In reality, I'd say pretty bad, because he actually led a few expeditions to the Arctic before, most of which had failed. Led expeditions to find this Northwest Passage, not much luck. And indeed one, in 1820, led to starvation and men dying. And he actually had a nickname, the man who ate his boots, because of course he boiled up leather of his boots, allegedly, and ate them. So his track record in the Arctic is not good. Why is he chosen then? Well, there is an element of desperation from the Admiralty. They want to find this. There are other countries rivaling it. Also, others just don't want to do it. James Clark Ross, a much more reliable naval captain at the time, said, no, I'm not going to do it. So there's a little desperation. Why does he want to do it at this great age? Well, personal glory, of course, but he's actually been down in Tasmania. He's been governor of Van Diemen's Land, what we now call Tasmania, for the past 15 years. So he's been a bit of a nobody. This is his final chance to go for it. Interesting about that statue, at the front of it is a rather interesting frieze, a sort of relief of an interesting scene that's going on. It's with Franklin in his coffin, lots of somber men, and crucially in the background you can see two ships crumpled and stuck in the ice. This is Greenhithe in Kent, and in 1845 all along here were some huge docks, part of the British Navy Arctic School. More on that in a moment. And in July of 1845, two ships known as HMS Erebus and HMS Terror set sail from here for the Arctic. They were commanded by a man called Sir John Franklin, commanding the Erebus, and Sir Francis Crozier, commanding the Terror. Now, actually, the Erebus and the Terror had already been on a huge expedition from 1839 to 1843, all the way down to the Antarctic and around Australia and all that. So these ships were really well prepared, well versed in exploration. Still, having said that, where they were going was seriously far north, seriously cold, so they needed preparing. And indeed, that's what happened here. They were reinforced with steel all around it to break through the ice. They had a lovely new heating system with pipes and all that. They had steam engines from trains put on then in case that they couldn't use the sails because they were frozen, that they could propel themselves. And crucially, they also had these rudders and the anchors or whatever, the things that you could retract them out so that they couldn't get stuck in the ice. They also had food supplies for 3 years, dried vegetables, grains, all sorts of things, and the new invention of canning vegetables or canning anything, within a tin. They had 6,000 of these cans on board. More on that later, which is very crucial. And in total it was 129 men who were very well trained. As I said, this was the location of the British Navy Arctic School, and they'd been trained in how to deal with the Arctic. They had a lot of training in sledging, how to sort of get themselves across the Arctic ice, maybe to get provisions and supplies, how to deal with the cold, how to tackle a polar bear, which, other than running, I'm not sure how you quite would do that, just how to exist in difficult conditions. So these were well-trained men ready for the expedition. This is Greenwich, specifically the Royal Naval College, where John Franklin and many of his officers would have trained. And this is a good place to tell actually what happens on the expedition itself. So they leave Greenhithe in the spring of 1845, eventually getting to Greenland, where they send some letters home, and crucially also, four sailors who got ill, they get sent home from there. They might have thought themselves unlucky at the time, but what's going to happen next shows that they were actually very lucky indeed. So 125 men leave Greenland and they get to Baffin Island in the Arctic, and they hunker down there for the winter of 1845. Come the spring of 1846, they leave Baffin Island and they go down the Peel Sound to King William Island, exploring, trying to find the Northwest Passage. And then September of 1846, there's suddenly a chill across the Arctic land and the ice comes a bit earlier and they get frozen in. HMS Terror and HMS Erebus, they get locked in the ice, and that ice actually doesn't shift for 2 years. So there they are, through the winter of 1846 into 1847, a bit grim, but they are able to push forward because they think, well, the ice will melt come the spring, but sadly it does not. Come the spring of 1847, the ice does not melt, they are locked in. Worse yet, on June the 11th, 1847, John Franklin dies. What does he die of? Well, he's a 60-year-old man in the Arctic. What do you kind of expect? Anyway, morale is bad. Men start to get a bit panicky, they're not getting out, food running out, etc. Not good, and they then have to face another brutal winter, 1847 into 1848. Come the spring of 1848, and again, the ice has not melted. They are going mad, they have to do something. So what do? They decide to leave the stricken boats and head off on the land to walk, to try and find somewhere where they can escape to. A mad, mad decision. And one by one, by this time about 24 men had died, about 100 of them set off onto this mad death march. One by one they die of starvation, exposure, etc. Now, how do we know about this? Well, there are notes that are left, more of which in a moment, but we also know about, because the Inuits, the indigenous people from the northern Canadian Arctic, they tell the oral history, nothing's written down, an oral history of encounters with white men going on this ridiculous expedition. I say ridiculous because they were carrying heavy sledges on which were writing desks to write things down, novels and books and all sorts of things. Why they need that on a death march across the Arctic, I don't really know. But anyway, that's the case. And also the Inuits did say they tried to help them, but they were pushed off a little bit. By 1848, nothing had been heard about from the ships. And so the Admiralty here starts to get a bit worried and indeed sends out rescue missions. Now, at first, these rescue missions were not very successful for obvious reasons. Arctic conditions, remote locations, nobody knows anything. There's also a little bit of British arrogance there. They were very slow in the uptake of these expeditions because they thought, well, these men, they're stout Englishmen, they'll survive, they'll be fine. And classic British arrogance, they ignore the locals, ignore the Inuits saying, yeah, we saw them over there, they pushed away from that. So what a surprise. But things start to really gather a momentum, partly because of Lady Jane Franklin, John Franklin's wife. She puts pressure on Parliament and government to find these men. She takes out adverts in the newspaper and talks to journalists. She offers rewards. She even travels to Orkney on an orchestrated sort of thing for the media to get as close as she can to her husband. This creates a national fervour and huge questions are asked in the media. Where is the Franklin expedition? News comes in 1854 with the discovery of 3 graves of Englishmen, men, soldiers or sailors who had died on the Franklin expedition. And indeed some people have actually started to listen to the Inuits who have said, yeah, we saw them, these desperate men, a lot of them died or they've gone off into the woods or somewhat. These stories come back, creating more and more fervour. But finally, by 1859, 14 years after the expedition left, concrete proof is found. It is a note written on paper that came from this building, Admiralty note paper. It was a note, there were actually 2. The first note was written in the April of 1847, which said, yes, it's Franklin here, we're trapped in the ice, all things are okay so far, morale's all right-ish, it's fine, we're sort of running out of food maybe, we're stuck in the ice, hopefully it will thaw, see you later, fine. Though the second note then was written 1 year later, May of 1848, and this note was much, much darker in tone. It was written by Crozier, the second in command, and this note said, "Franklin is dead. Many men are also dead. We've run out of food. We've been trapped in the ice for 2 years. It's desperate. People are going mad. We are going to launch an expedition on foot now to go and find help." Let's fast forward all the way to 2014 when a discovery is made in the Arctic Ocean. They find a ship. That of HMS Erebus is found. 2 years later, 2016, unbelievably, and most importantly, 57 miles away from the Erebus, they find another ship, the Terror, HMS Terror, Franklin's ship. They find it miles away from where the Erebus is. Clearly they had split off at some point, and it's in unbelievably good condition. People with artifacts still around. It clearly looks as if the men had to leave in quite a bit of a rush in the end. But they have found the boats. They are down there in the Arctic. What happened to them? Even more questions were created from this. The only other question to ask is, what do we do? Do we leave the boats there? Do we bring them up to make a museum? Do they return them to any of the families? Questions abound. Behind me, of course, is the world famous Fortnum & Mason, a place you go to for provisions, especially if you're going on a big Arctic expedition. And indeed, Fortnum & Mason did provide some of the provisions for the Franklin expedition. They sort of, soup, the dried soup that was meant to be very nutritious, tea, very famous Fortnum & Mason tea, hard tack, which is this sort of biscuit which eventually got a load of weevils in it, not very nice. But one thing that they did not supply was the tinned or canned food, the canned meat, sort of mixed with fats and various things like that. They couldn't actually get the order done because the order was taken really late. The chaotic nature of the Franklin expedition, 7 weeks before departure, they suddenly decided they needed canned food. But the reason why this is interesting is canned food was in its infancy, a very new technology, and so they got this bloke called Stephen Goldnut, and he said, "Could you please make 8,000 cans of tinned meat?" And he did it in a real rush. The problem was it was rushed, and I don't think it didn't work very well, the canning. So a lot of the food was actually spoiled in the end by the time they opened it, 2 years eventually in the frozen tundra. But worse yet, when they, many, many years later, when they actually did some analysis on some of the dead bodies they found the levels of lead, unbelievably high, lead poisoning essentially. So these men had been poisoned by the canned food they had. This is interesting because one of the symptoms of lead poisoning is you make odd decisions, confusion, decisions such as going off into the tundra to find safety or something like that. So really interesting. The other food-related thing to talk about, of course, is cannibalism. Now the Inuits, they had said, yes, they saw these white men eating one another, cannibalism. And at the time, all the families and the admiralties, they said, absolutely not, this is outrageous. No upstanding British officer or sailor man would ever possibly eat another person. Terrible, terrible. However, again, analysis of the bodies many, many years later suggests that cut marks on the bones suggest that the sort of flesh was hacked off as if eaten. So it does look as if the men resorted to cannibalism. Was that desperation? Was it lead poisoning? Who knows? Here at Greenhide, interestingly, there's not actually many memorials at all to anything here. There's a sort of abstract picture of a boat going on around here, and there is a pub called the Sir John Franklin with a slightly yellowing, aging sign on it. But what's really interesting, there's no sign of the docks at all. It would have been huge with this naval school and boats going in and out, etc. It's now a bit sleepy with the huge Dartford crossing going over it. So rather interesting, really. So there we go, a sad tale there, and one that's really captivated the nation. Anyway, I hope you have enjoyed that as much as I have. And as always, please make sure you subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.